Hello, and welcome back to Sleepy History 5.00. Tonight, we are going to follow the strange and unforgettable story of one of the most mysterious men in Russian history, Grigori Rasputin. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these long, quiet journeys through history. It costs nothing, and it helps us continue making stories like this for you. And do one more thing for me. In the comments, tell us where in the world you are listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. Somewhere else, perhaps thousands of miles away, another person may be awake beneath the same night sky, listening to the very same story. There is something strangely comforting about that. Now settle in. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breathing become slow and easy. You do not need to remember every name or date tonight. Just listen. In the final years of the Russian Empire, when palaces glittered with gold and millions of ordinary people lived in poverty, a mysterious peasant from Siberia somehow found his way into the private world of Russia's most powerful family. His name was Grigori Rasputin. To some, he was a holy man. To others, he was a fraud. To his enemies, he was dangerous. And to the Imperial family, he became someone they believed could save the life of their dying son. His story would become tangled with faith, politics, war, scandal, and revolution, but it began far away from the magnificent palaces of St. Petersburg. It began in a small Siberian village, beneath enormous skies and long, freezing winters. And there, a boy was born who could never have imagined that one day his name would be whispered inside the halls of the Russian Imperial Palace. His journey was about to begin. Grigori Rasputin was born in 1869 in the small Siberian village of Pokrovskoye, beside the wide and powerful Tura River. It was a world far removed from the elegant streets of St. Petersburg. There were no grand palaces here, no enormous theaters, and no glittering imperial ceremonies. Most people lived close to the land, worked with their hands, and measured life by the seasons. Rasputin grew up in this harsh but deeply religious environment. His father, Efim, was a peasant and a village coachman. The family was not wealthy, but they belonged to the Orthodox Christian tradition that shaped nearly every part of daily life. As a young man, Grigori did not immediately appear destined for greatness. He married a woman named Praskovia and began raising a family. But something inside him seemed restless. According to accounts from his later life, Rasputin experienced a powerful religious awakening in his 20s. He began traveling as a pilgrim, walking enormous distances to visit monasteries and holy places. He wore simple clothing and lived for periods as a wandering religious seeker. These journeys changed him. He became known as a stranik, a wanderer searching for spiritual truth. Yet even during these early years, stories about Rasputin were already becoming difficult to separate from legend. Some people described him as deeply devout. Others believed he was strange, unpredictable, and capable of manipulating those around him. Eventually, his reputation as a spiritual man began spreading beyond his village. He traveled through Russia, meeting priests, monks, peasants, and wealthy believers. And wherever he went, people remembered him. He had piercing eyes, an intense presence, and a remarkable ability to speak with confidence to almost anyone. By the beginning of the 20th century, Rasputin was no longer simply a Siberian peasant. He was becoming a religious wanderer with a growing reputation. And eventually, his travels would bring him toward the glittering capital of the Russian Empire. St. Petersburg was waiting, and inside its imperial palace lived a family whose private tragedy would transform Rasputin's life forever. By the early years of the 20th century, Rasputin had begun to attract attention beyond Siberia. His reputation traveled ahead of him. People said that he could pray with unusual intensity. Others claimed that he understood their troubles without being told. Some believed his presence brought comfort, while others suspected something darker beneath his religious image. Eventually, Rasputin made his way to St. Petersburg. The city could not have been more different from the quiet Siberian village where he had grown up. St. Petersburg was the heart of Imperial Russia, filled with enormous palaces, wide avenues, churches, government buildings, and members of the aristocracy who lived lives of extraordinary luxury. At the center of this world stood Emperor Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra. Nicholas was the last emperor of Russia. He was deeply devoted to his family and believed that his authority came from God. Alexandra, meanwhile, was intensely religious and deeply protective of her children. But behind the palace walls, the imperial family carried a terrible secret. Their only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia. Even a small injury could become dangerous because his blood did not clot normally. For his parents, every bruise could become a nightmare. The boy was heir to the Russian throne, yet his life could be threatened by something as ordinary as a fall. Alexandra lived in constant fear. Doctors could do little. Prayer became increasingly important. Then Rasputin entered their world. At first, he was simply another religious figure among many who passed through the capital. But something about him caught Alexandra's attention. Rasputin seemed able to calm the desperate mother when others could not. The exact circumstances of their first meetings remained surrounded by uncertainty, but his relationship with the imperial family gradually became stronger. And then came the moment that changed everything. Alexei suffered a serious bleeding episode. His family feared that the young heir might die. Rasputin was called. He prayed for the boy, and somehow Alexei improved. To Alexandra, this was more than coincidence. It was a sign. From that moment forward, Rasputin's place inside the imperial household became much more important. The Siberian wanderer had entered the palace, and he was about to become one of the most controversial men in Russia. Alexei's illness changed everything. For Alexandra, the boy was not simply her son. He was the future of the Russian Empire. Every episode of bleeding brought fear into the palace. Doctors could offer limited help, and the family often turned toward prayer when medicine seemed unable to stop the danger. Rasputin appeared to give Alexandra something the doctors could not: hope. He spoke calmly when others panicked. He told the family to remain confident and trust in God. On several occasions, Alexei's condition improved after Rasputin had been involved. The reasons remained debated. Some historians have suggested that Rasputin's calm presence reduced the boy's anxiety and helped prevent further bleeding. Others have pointed to medical decisions that may have benefited Alexei, including keeping him quiet and avoiding certain treatments that could worsen bleeding. But Alexandra did not see complicated medical explanations. She saw a man whose prayers seemed to work. Her trust in him became extraordinarily strong. Nicholas II was more cautious. He did not immediately share his wife's complete confidence in Rasputin. Yet he understood how important the man had become to Alexandra and to their son. Rasputin was now allowed unusual access to the imperial family. He could enter places that most ordinary Russians could never approach. And this created a dangerous situation. The farther Rasputin moved into the world of the palace, the more people began to question him. Rumors spread through St. Petersburg. Some claimed that he possessed supernatural powers. Others accused him of immoral behavior. There were stories of women gathering around him, stories of drunken nights, and accusations that he used religion as a disguise for personal pleasure. Not every story was true. Some were exaggerated by enemies who wanted him destroyed. But Rasputin's reputation was becoming increasingly difficult to control. To ordinary Russians, he seemed like a mysterious peasant who had somehow gained influence over the emperor. To aristocrats, politicians, and members of the royal court, he was becoming something far more threatening. And soon, the whispers surrounding him would grow into a political storm. Rasputin had entered the palace as a spiritual advisor, but he was beginning to look like a man with influence over the Russian throne itself. As Rasputin's influence grew, St. Petersburg began to whisper. The Russian capital was a city where information traveled quickly through drawing rooms, churches, restaurants, and government offices. A strange story told in one palace could become a scandal across the city within days. And Rasputin was becoming the center of many of those stories. He was still a peasant from Siberia, yet he was now welcomed into aristocratic homes. Wealthy women sought his advice. Religious figures debated his character. Politicians wondered how much influence he truly possessed over the imperial family. The contrast was extraordinary. Russia was ruled by an emperor surrounded by centuries of tradition, yet one of the people closest to his family was a rough-looking wanderer with little formal education. Rasputin understood the power of attention. He listened to people, spoke confidently, and often presented himself as someone who understood ordinary human weakness. His followers saw humility and spiritual wisdom. His enemies saw manipulation. Both images would follow him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, Russia itself was becoming increasingly unstable. The country was enormous, but poverty was widespread. Millions of peasants struggled to survive, while industrial workers crowded into rapidly growing cities. Political opposition to Nicholas II was increasing. The emperor's government was struggling to respond to demands for reform. And in this atmosphere, every rumor surrounding the royal family became more dangerous. Critics began claiming that Alexandra was under Rasputin's control. Some even suggested that Rasputin was secretly directing government decisions. There was little evidence for the wildest versions of these stories, but perception mattered. People did not need proof to become suspicious. Rasputin's presence near the royal family became a symbol of everything critics disliked about the imperial system: secrecy, privilege, poor judgment, and distance from ordinary people. Yet inside the palace, Alexandra continued to believe that Rasputin was protecting her son. She could not simply abandon the man she believed might be responsible for Alexei's survival. And Rasputin knew exactly how valuable that trust was. As Russia moved toward a dangerous future, his personal relationship with the imperial family was becoming inseparable from the political crisis surrounding them. Soon, the First World War would begin. And when Russia entered the conflict, Rasputin's influence would become even more controversial. Part 6. In 1914, Europe was moving toward catastrophe. An assassination in Sarajevo set off a chain of events that pulled one great power after another into war. Russia entered the conflict against Germany and Austria-Hungary. At first, many Russians gathered around the emperor. Patriotic crowds filled the streets, and Nicholas II presented himself as the leader who would guide his country through the crisis. But the war quickly became far more difficult than anyone expected. Millions of Russian soldiers were sent to the front. Weapons and supplies were often insufficient. Communication was poor, transportation systems struggled, and casualties began to rise. For Rasputin, the war was deeply troubling. He believed Russia should avoid unnecessary bloodshed and warned against rushing into a massive European conflict. But his advice was not welcomed by everyone. To many political opponents, Rasputin seemed dangerously close to the imperial family at exactly the moment when Russia needed competent leadership. Then came another important decision. In 1915, Nicholas II personally took command of the Russian army. He left Petrograd, the imperial capital, to spend much of his time at military headquarters. The decision placed enormous responsibility on Alexandra. She remained in the capital, managing the household and communicating frequently with her husband. And Rasputin's position near her became even more significant. Alexandra trusted him deeply. She believed he understood God's will and could guide her through the frightening uncertainty of the war. Rasputin sent advice to Nicholas and Alexandra, sometimes discussing ministers and political appointments. Whether his recommendations were actually decisive is still debated by historians. But the appearance of influence was enough to damage the monarchy. Enemies began describing Alexandra as controlled by a mysterious foreign-born woman and Rasputin as the hidden power behind the throne. The rumors became increasingly wild. Some newspapers and political opponents portrayed Rasputin as a traitor. Others claimed that he was working for Germany, an accusation for which there was no solid evidence. Still, the rumors spread, and while soldiers were dying at the front, ordinary people were facing shortages and rising prices at home. The distance between the imperial palace and the suffering population was becoming impossible to ignore. Rasputin remained inside the circle of the royal family. But outside those walls, the foundations of the empire were beginning to crack. And neither Rasputin nor the Romanovs could yet see how close the end was. Part 7. The winter of war grew harder. Across Russia, Families waited for letters from the front. Trains carried wounded soldiers back toward the cities, while factories struggled to produce enough supplies for an army fighting a massive modern war. In Petrograd, bread became increasingly difficult to obtain. People stood in long lines, sometimes for hours, hoping to bring something home for their families. Inside the imperial world, however, Rasputin remained an extraordinary figure. Alexandra continued to write to Nicholas, and Rasputin's advice was sometimes passed along with her messages. The emperor was far away at military headquarters, trying to direct a war that was becoming increasingly difficult. This arrangement created a dangerous political impression. Nicholas was the emperor, but critics believed that his wife was influencing government decisions from the capital, while Rasputin influenced Alexandra. The chain of suspicion was simple. Nicholas trusted Alexandra. Alexandra trusted Rasputin. Therefore, people assumed Rasputin was influencing the emperor himself. Reality was more complicated. Rasputin did not control the Russian government in the simple way later stories suggested. But he did have access. And access to a royal family during a national crisis could be enormously powerful. He sometimes recommended that certain officials be appointed or removed. Alexandra valued his judgment, particularly when she believed someone threatened the monarchy. At the same time, Rasputin continued living a strange double life. He could speak about prayer and repentance, yet stories about drinking and sexual relationships followed him. Some accusations were undoubtedly exaggerated. Others came from people who had personally encountered his reckless behavior. Rasputin seemed capable of being both sincere and deeply flawed. Perhaps that contradiction was part of what made him so fascinating. He was not easily placed into the categories of saint or villain. He was a complicated human being moving through an increasingly dangerous world. And while politicians argued about him, the Russian people were becoming more desperate. Food prices rose. Trust in the government declined. The war seemed endless. The monarchy looked increasingly isolated. By 1916, the empire was exhausted. And among some members of the aristocracy, a terrifying idea was beginning to take shape. Perhaps Rasputin himself had to be removed, not merely from the palace, but permanently. The plan that followed would turn Rasputin's mysterious reputation into one of the most famous stories in Russian history. By late 1916, Russia was exhausted. The war had brought enormous casualties, shortages, and growing anger toward the government. In Petrograd, people were losing faith in the monarchy. Rasputin had become a symbol of that crisis. His enemies believed that removing him might weaken the influence of Alexandra and restore confidence in the imperial government. Among those who wanted him gone was Prince Felix Yusupov, one of the wealthiest men in Russia. Yusupov was young, aristocratic, and closely connected to the imperial family through marriage. He began discussing a plan with other conspirators. Their goal was simple. Rasputin had to die, but they wanted his death to appear as a private act rather than an open political assassination. Yusupov decided to lure Rasputin to his palace. He told him that his wife, Princess Irina, would be there. Rasputin agreed to come. On the night of December 29, 1916, he entered the Yusupov palace. He had no idea that he was walking into a carefully prepared trap. The conspirators were waiting, and before the night was over, the man who had spent years surrounded by rumors, faith, fear, and political intrigue would become the subject of an even greater legend. The final hours of Rasputin's life were about to begin. Inside the Yusupov palace, Rasputin was taken downstairs to a private room. The conspirators had prepared food and wine. According to Yusupov's later account, poison had been placed in the food and drinks. They expected Rasputin to die quickly, but he did not. Rasputin ate and drank while Yusupov watched anxiously. Minutes passed. Still, nothing seemed to happen. The conspirators became frightened. Yusupov later claimed that he eventually shot Rasputin. The story became famous because, according to his account, Rasputin somehow survived the first attack. He supposedly rose again and tried to escape. More shots followed. Eventually, the conspirators carried his body outside and threw it into the icy Neva River. For decades, this story helped create the legend of Rasputin as a nearly supernatural figure. But historians have questioned many details. The famous story comes largely from accounts written by the conspirators themselves, especially Yusupov. Modern investigations suggest that some of the dramatic details may have been exaggerated. The poison story, in particular, remains uncertain. What is certain is that Rasputin was murdered in December 1916. His death did not save the Russian monarchy. In fact, the empire was already approaching its final crisis. Nicholas II remained emperor. Alexandra remained deeply devoted to her family. But the country around them was changing rapidly. The war continued. Food shortages worsened. Public anger grew. And only a few weeks after Rasputin's death, Russia would experience an upheaval that changed the course of world history. The strange Siberian peasant was gone. But the empire he had become associated with was not far behind him. Rasputin's murder shocked the imperial family. Alexandra was devastated. She had believed that Rasputin was a protector sent by God, especially for her son Alexei. Now he was dead, but the tragedy did not end with his death. Instead, Russia moved even closer to revolution. By early 1917, Petrograd was struggling with severe shortages. Women waited in long bread lines. Workers became increasingly angry. Soldiers were exhausted by years of war. The government seemed unable to solve the crisis. Then, in February, demonstrations began growing across the capital. At first, many protesters were demanding bread. Soon, the crowds were demanding an end to the war and changes to the government. Nicholas II was away from the capital. He tried to respond, but events were moving faster than his orders. Soldiers were eventually ordered to restore control. Instead, many of them refused. Some joined the protesters. The authority of the imperial government began collapsing almost overnight. Nicholas finally realized that he could no longer maintain control. On March 15, 1917, he abdicated the throne. After more than 3 centuries, the Romanov dynasty had come to an end. The strange thing was that Rasputin had been dead for only a few months. Yet the problems he had seemed to represent remained everywhere. Political corruption, distrust, war, poverty, and a royal family increasingly separated from the people it ruled. Rasputin himself had not caused the Russian Revolution. The empire's problems were much deeper and had existed long before he entered the palace. But his story had become a powerful symbol of the monarchy's weakness. To many Russians, the image was unforgettable. A mysterious peasant had entered the palace, gained the trust of the emperor's family, and become associated with a government that was losing its grip. Now that government was gone. The Romanovs were prisoners. The world they had known was disappearing. And Rasputin's name, instead of fading away, was about to become even more famous. His life would continue to be debated long after his death. After Nicholas II abdicated, Russia entered an uncertain new era. The emperor and his family were placed under guard. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled Russia for more than 300 years, was finished. But the country was not suddenly peaceful. The war continued. Political groups competed for power, and ordinary people still struggled with hunger and uncertainty. Meanwhile, Rasputin's name continued to appear in newspapers, memoirs, and political arguments. Many people blamed him for the failures of the monarchy. Stories about his supposed influence became larger with every retelling. Some claimed he had controlled Alexandra. Others imagined him as a secret political master who had manipulated the entire empire. But the truth was less dramatic. Rasputin had influence, especially with Alexandra, but he did not possess unlimited power. He could recommend people. He could offer opinions. He could gain access to the imperial family. Yet Russia's enormous political and military problems could not be controlled by one man. The empire had been weakened by decades of social inequality, political conflict, economic problems, and the enormous pressures of modern war. Still, Rasputin's unusual position made him an easy target. He represented the secretive world around the imperial family. And because he was so mysterious, people could project almost anything onto him. Was he a holy man? A manipulator? A sincere believer? A reckless man who happened to find himself close to the throne? Perhaps he was a mixture of all these things. Even after his death, the mystery remained. His relationship with Alexandra was especially controversial. She genuinely believed that he could help her son. For a mother watching her child suffer from a dangerous hereditary disease, that belief was emotionally powerful. And Rasputin understood Alexei's importance. Whether through prayer, calming advice, or simple coincidence, his presence sometimes seemed to bring relief. That was enough to make Alexandra trust him. But in the outside world, that private trust had become a political disaster. The Romanovs were now gone from power. Russia was moving toward a completely different future. And the story of Rasputin was about to pass from living memory into legend. The revolution changed Russia, but it did not immediately bring peace. After Nicholas II stepped down, a temporary government tried to lead the country. At the same time, workers and soldiers formed councils known as Soviets. Two centers of power now existed. The situation was unstable, and the war continued. Meanwhile, the former imperial family remained under guard. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were eventually moved away from the capital. Their future was becoming increasingly uncertain. Rasputin, of course, was no longer there to witness any of it. Yet his name continued to circulate. The Bolsheviks, who would eventually seize power, had little reason to defend him. To revolutionaries, Rasputin represented the corrupt final years of the old regime. But even among those who hated the monarchy, his story was often exaggerated. One reason was that Rasputin had become an almost perfect character for political propaganda. He was mysterious. He came from humble origins. He had access to the royal family, and his death involved a secret plot. All of these details made his story irresistible. As years passed, books and newspapers repeated dramatic versions of his life. The famous image of Rasputin as an almost supernatural figure became stronger. His eyes were described as hypnotic. His personality was presented as irresistible. His survival during the assassination was turned into something almost impossible. But history rarely behaves like a legend. Rasputin was not an immortal mystic. He was a human being. He made mistakes. He drank too much. He enjoyed attention. He sometimes behaved recklessly. He also appears to have possessed genuine religious conviction and a remarkable ability to understand people. That combination made him difficult to classify. Perhaps that is why his story has survived. Rasputin stood at the intersection of faith and politics. He belonged to a deeply religious culture, yet he became entangled with the most powerful political family in Russia. He wanted spiritual influence, but his proximity to power transformed him into a political figure. And when the empire collapsed, his name became permanently attached to its final chapter. But there was still much more to understand about the man behind the legend. To understand Rasputin, we have to return to the world that shaped him. Late 19th century Russia was deeply religious. For millions of ordinary people, Orthodox Christianity was not simply something practiced on Sundays. It was woven into family life, festivals, funerals, marriage, and the rhythm of the seasons. Rasputin grew up surrounded by that culture. He did not receive a sophisticated theological education. Instead, his religious understanding came through prayer, pilgrimage, stories, and personal experience. His journeys across Russia helped build his reputation as a spiritual wanderer. People often approached men like Rasputin because they wanted something different from formal religious institutions. They wanted advice. They wanted comfort. Sometimes they wanted miracles. Rasputin had an unusual ability to give people the feeling that he understood them. He could speak simply, look directly at someone, and make them feel that their problems mattered. That talent became extremely valuable when he reached St. Petersburg. The aristocracy was fascinated by religious mysticism. Some wealthy families searched for spiritual figures who could provide meaning in a rapidly changing world. Rasputin fit perfectly into that environment. But his behavior remained controversial. He did not resemble the traditional image of a quiet monk. He could be loud, confident, and socially unpredictable. He enjoyed food, alcohol, and the company of other people. This contradiction confused many observers. How could a man who spoke about repentance behave so freely? His supporters saw a complicated sinner who understood human weakness. His enemies saw hypocrisy. The truth may have been somewhere between those extremes. Rasputin was neither the perfect saint described by some admirers nor the supernatural monster created by some later stories. He was a deeply imperfect man who found himself in an extraordinary position. And his greatest power may not have been mystical at all. It may have been his ability to inspire trust. That ability brought him close to Alexandra. And once Alexandra trusted him, Rasputin's place in Russian history was almost impossible to undo. Alexandra's trust in Rasputin was rooted in something deeply personal. Her son Alexei suffered from hemophilia, a condition that could turn an ordinary injury into a life-threatening emergency. The family lived with constant fear. A simple fall could cause internal bleeding. A small wound could become dangerous. For Alexandra, this was not a political problem. It was the suffering of her child. And whenever Alexei became seriously ill, Rasputin sometimes appeared to calm the situation. One famous episode occurred in 1912, when Alexei suffered severe bleeding while the family was staying at their hunting retreat. Doctors feared for his life. Alexandra was desperate. Rasputin was contacted. He sent a message telling the family not to become overwhelmed by fear and to trust that the boy would recover. Soon afterward, Alexei's condition improved. Exactly why remains debated. Some historians believe Rasputin's calm advice may have helped the boy remain quiet and relaxed, reducing physical stress. Others point to medical factors that could explain the recovery. But Alexandra saw something different. She saw a man whose prayers had reached her son when doctors had failed. Her faith in Rasputin became stronger. From then on, she defended him against criticism. This created a difficult cycle. The more Alexandra trusted Rasputin, the more her enemies attacked him. The more they attacked him, the more she believed he was being persecuted. Rasputin became almost impossible to remove from her private circle. Nicholas II understood his wife's feelings. He loved Alexandra and shared her concern for Alexei, but he was also increasingly surrounded by political problems. Every decision involving Rasputin became controversial. A recommendation could become a rumor. A visit to the palace could become a scandal. And a private conversation could be transformed into a political accusation. The Imperial family wanted privacy. But by this point, almost nothing about them remained private. Russia was watching, and the closer Rasputin stood to the throne, the more dangerous his presence became. By 1915, the relationship between Rasputin and the Imperial family had become one of the most controversial subjects in Russia. Nicholas II had taken personal command of the army, leaving Alexandra in Petrograd. The Empress was isolated. She was surrounded by court officials, ministers, advisors, and political enemies. Yet she trusted very few people. Rasputin was one of the exceptions. He continued sending advice and messages. Alexandra believed he understood the spiritual condition of Russia and could help protect the monarchy. But the political world saw something else. The government was changing ministers rapidly. Officials came and went. Each appointment created new rumors. Opposition politicians began speaking openly about the influence of the Empress and her mysterious advisor. Some accused Rasputin of controlling appointments. Others claimed that Alexandra was effectively ruling Russia while Nicholas was away. These accusations were often exaggerated, but they damaged public confidence. The press became increasingly hostile. Cartoons and stories portrayed Rasputin as a sinister figure hiding behind the throne. His name became associated with everything people disliked about the imperial government. Meanwhile, the real crisis was becoming much larger. The war was consuming men, money, food, and supplies. Russia's transportation network struggled. Factories could not always meet military demand. In cities, shortages became more serious. The government needed public trust more than ever. Instead, trust was disappearing. Rasputin himself seemed unable to understand how dangerous his reputation had become. He continued visiting people, drinking, offering advice, and moving through society with unusual confidence. To his supporters, he was simply living as himself. To his enemies, every action became evidence of corruption. By now, Rasputin was no longer merely a religious wanderer. He had become a political symbol, and symbols can become more powerful than facts. The tragedy was that while everyone argued about Rasputin, the deeper problems of Russia continued growing. Soon, the war would bring the empire to the edge of collapse, and Rasputin would find himself standing directly in the path of that collapse. The year 1916 was becoming a turning point. Russia had been fighting the First World War for more than 2 years, and the cost was enormous. Millions of soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured. At home, families struggled with rising prices and shortages. In Petrograd, long lines for bread became part of everyday life. People were tired, they were angry, and increasingly they were losing faith in the government. Inside the imperial family, Alexandra remained convinced that Russia could survive if people remained loyal to the throne. Rasputin continued to advise her. He warned against certain ministers and sometimes encouraged the emperor to make changes. But every recommendation created suspicion. The political opposition believed that the country was being governed through private influence rather than competent institutions. By this point, even members of the aristocracy were becoming alarmed. Some believed that Rasputin's presence was damaging the monarchy beyond repair. A few began discussing an extreme solution. They did not necessarily believe that killing Rasputin would solve every problem, but they believed removing him might give the imperial family a chance to recover. Among the conspirators was Prince Felix Yusupov. He belonged to one of Russia's richest families. He was married to Princess Irina, a niece of Nicholas II. Another participant was Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, a member of the Romanov family. Several others were involved as well. Their discussions were secret. They knew that murdering a man connected to the imperial family could have enormous consequences. But they convinced themselves that Rasputin was dangerous enough to justify the risk. Plan was formed. Yusupov would invite Rasputin to his palace. The story would be that Rasputin was going to meet Irina. In reality, the meeting would be a trap. The conspirators prepared everything carefully. They believed that once Rasputin entered the palace, he would never leave alive. But they could not have known that the murder would become one of the most famous and disputed episodes in modern history. The night of the murder arrived. It was late December 1916, and Petrograd was covered in winter darkness. Rasputin was invited to the Yusupov palace. According to Felix Yusupov's later account, he arrived expecting to meet Princess Irina. But Irina was not actually there. Yusupov had prepared a room downstairs, away from the main areas of the palace. Food and wine were placed on a table. The conspirators waited nearby. Rasputin sat down and began eating. The plan was supposed to be simple. Poison had allegedly been placed in the food and wine. The conspirators expected him to become sick and die. But time passed. Rasputin continued eating. Nothing obvious happened. Yusupov became increasingly nervous. According to his memoirs, he eventually decided to shoot Rasputin. He returned with a revolver and fired. Rasputin fell. The conspirators believed it was over. But then, according to Yusupov's dramatic account, Rasputin moved. He struggled to his feet and attempted to escape. The story became legendary. Rasputin, supposedly wounded and poisoned, was still alive. More gunshots followed. Eventually, the conspirators subdued him. His body was wrapped and taken outside. They threw it into the freezing Neva River. When the news spread, the story immediately became sensational. The man who had been described as almost impossible to kill now appeared to have survived poison, bullets, and the freezing night. But there is an important problem. Much of the famous story comes from the people who killed him. Later forensic evidence did not support every dramatic detail. There is no convincing proof that poison played the role later stories claimed. The exact sequence of events remains uncertain. What we do know is that Rasputin was murdered by a group of aristocratic conspirators. His death was intended to protect the monarchy. Instead, it became another sign of how deeply the imperial system had fractured. The palace had turned against itself, and Russia was only weeks away from revolution. The news of Rasputin's death spread quickly through Petrograd. For some aristocrats, there was relief. For others, there was fear. The imperial family was devastated. Alexandra was especially shaken because she believed Rasputin had been one of the few people capable of helping Alexei. Nicholas II was furious when he learned what had happened. The conspirators had connections to the royal family, which made the situation even more complicated. Prince Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry could not simply be treated like ordinary criminals. Nicholas eventually ordered them to leave the capital. The decision showed just how strange the final days of the monarchy had become. A group of aristocrats had murdered a man close to the imperial family, believing they were saving the throne. But the throne itself was already in enormous danger. The war continued. The economy was deteriorating. Food shortages were worsening, and public confidence in Nicholas II had almost disappeared. Rasputin's death changed very little. The problems remained. Within weeks, demonstrations began across Petrograd. Workers demanded bread. Women marched through the streets. Soon, soldiers refused orders to suppress the crowds. The imperial government lost control. Nicholas II eventually abdicated. The Romanov dynasty ended. For more than 3 centuries, the family had ruled Russia. Now it was finished. The irony was extraordinary. Rasputin had been murdered because some people believed he was destroying the monarchy. But his death did not save it. The empire collapsed almost immediately afterward. Yet the story did not end there. The former emperor and his family were taken into captivity. The political situation became increasingly violent. A new revolutionary government struggled to maintain control. Then the Bolsheviks seized power. Russia entered a civil war, and the Romanov family was moved farther and farther away from the world they had once ruled. Rasputin had already become a legend. Now his story would become permanently connected with the final days of the Russian Empire. But one question remained. Who was the real Rasputin? The answer was far more complicated than the legend suggested. To understand the real Rasputin, we have to separate the man from the legend. For generations, stories about him have described a mysterious holy man with supernatural powers. Some versions make him almost impossible to kill. Others portray him as a sinister mastermind who secretly controlled the Russian Empire. Neither picture is completely reliable. Rasputin was certainly unusual. He had a powerful personality and an ability to make people feel that he understood them. He also had a reputation for religious intensity. But he was not a monk in the traditional sense. He was a married peasant who traveled as a religious pilgrim. He had no formal position inside the Russian Orthodox Church. That distinction is important. Many people who encountered him considered him a spiritual figure, but the official church was far more skeptical. Rasputin's relationship with religion was personal and unconventional. He spoke about sin, repentance, suffering, and salvation. Yet he also lived in ways that seemed to contradict the moral standards he preached. That contradiction became one of the central mysteries surrounding him. Was he a sincere believer who struggled with his own weaknesses? Was he deliberately manipulating people? Or was he simply a charismatic man whose reputation grew beyond his control? There may never be a perfect answer. The same uncertainty surrounds his influence over Nicholas and Alexandra. Rasputin clearly had access to the imperial family. Alexandra trusted him deeply. He sometimes offered political advice. But the idea that he personally controlled Russia is almost certainly an exaggeration. The empire was simply too large and its problems too complex. The First World War, economic hardship, political divisions, military failures, and public distrust had much deeper causes. Rasputin did not create those problems, but he became a symbol of them. and sometimes a symbol can become more powerful than reality. That is why his name survived. Not because he was necessarily the most powerful man in Russia, but because his strange journey placed him at the exact center of one of history's greatest collapses. There was another reason Rasputin became so unforgettable. He seemed to belong to two completely different worlds. One was the world of ordinary Russian peasants, where he had been born and raised. The other was the glittering world of the imperial court. He could travel from a humble village background into rooms filled with nobles, diplomats, and members of the royal family. That journey alone was extraordinary, but Rasputin's appearance also made him memorable. He was tall and bearded, with intense eyes and an unusual presence. Photographs of him often make him appear almost otherworldly. Later generations looked at those photographs and imagined a mysterious prophet staring back at them. But photographs can be misleading. They capture one expression, one moment, one pose. Behind that image was a complicated man. Rasputin could be charming and persuasive. He could also be reckless and confrontational. He sometimes drank heavily. He enjoyed attention, and his private life became the subject of endless gossip. Some of the stories were based on real incidents. Others were probably exaggerated. His enemies had every reason to spread damaging rumors because attacking Rasputin was an easy way to attack the imperial family. The more scandalous the story, the more powerful it became. By the final years of the monarchy, Rasputin's name had become almost synonymous with corruption. But there was a strange contradiction. The same man accused of destroying the monarchy was also deeply trusted by the Empress because she believed he could protect her son. That personal relationship was the key to everything. Alexandra did not need Rasputin to become powerful. She needed him because she was terrified of losing her child. And Rasputin's apparent ability to calm Alexei gave him access that no ordinary advisor could have gained. In the end, his greatest influence came not from a government office, a military position, or a fortune. It came from trust, a mother's trust, and that trust placed a Siberian peasant at the center of the final chapter of Imperial Russia. Rasputin's influence was also shaped by the fears of the people around him. The imperial family lived behind layers of security and ceremony, but their private life was surprisingly fragile. Alexei's illness remained a constant threat. Alexandra worried about him almost every day. Nicholas carried the burden of ruling an enormous empire while trying to protect his family. And Rasputin appeared to offer them something simple: reassurance. He could sit with Alexandra and speak in a way that calmed her. That mattered. But outside the family, people saw only the result. They saw a peasant entering the palace. They saw the Empress defending him. They saw ministers being criticized or replaced. They saw a government increasingly losing public confidence. To them, Rasputin became proof that something was deeply wrong. This was especially dangerous during wartime. When soldiers were dying and families were hungry, patience for mysterious advisors was disappearing. Political opponents used Rasputin's name constantly. Rumors claimed that the palace was filled with corruption. Some even spread stories that Alexandra and Rasputin were working against Russia. These accusations were extremely damaging. Alexandra was German-born, although she had become deeply devoted to Russia. During the war against Germany, her background made her an easy target. The combination of Alexandra's German origins and Rasputin's influence created a perfect environment for conspiracy theories. Facts became less important than suspicion, and suspicion spread quickly. Even people who had never met Rasputin began believing they knew exactly what he was. A saint to some, a devil to others. But perhaps the most accurate description is simpler. He was a charismatic, deeply complicated man who entered the private life of a royal family at exactly the wrong moment in history. Russia was already under enormous pressure. Rasputin did not create the storm, but once he stood inside it, he became one of its most recognizable faces. And the storm was getting stronger. By 1917, the Russian Empire was approaching its breaking point. The war had drained the country. Factories struggled to keep up. Railways were overloaded. Food was becoming harder to transport into the cities. In Petrograd, bread lines stretched through the cold streets. People were tired of waiting. Then the protests began. At first, the demands were simple: bread, peace, better living conditions. But demonstrations quickly became larger. Workers joined, women marched, students appeared. Soon, entire neighborhoods were filled with protesters. The government ordered soldiers to restore order. But many soldiers were exhausted themselves. Some refused to fire on the crowds. Others joined the demonstrations. The authority of the imperial government began disappearing. Nicholas II was away from Petrograd and struggled to understand how quickly the situation was collapsing. Within days, the monarchy was finished. Nicholas abdicated. The Romanov dynasty came to an end. And Rasputin, who had once been described as the hidden power behind the throne, was already dead. His murder had happened only weeks earlier. That timing made his story even more haunting. The men who killed him believed they were saving the monarchy. But they had not understood how deep the crisis really was. Russia's problems were much larger than one man. The monarchy had lost the confidence of enormous parts of society. The war had created unbearable pressure. Political reform had come too slowly, and the imperial government had become increasingly isolated. Rasputin's presence had certainly damaged the monarchy's reputation. But removing him could not repair a system that was already collapsing. The revolution moved forward without him. Yet his name remained attached to the old world. Soon, the Romanov family would be prisoners. The Bolsheviks would seize power, and Russia would descend into civil war. The quiet Siberian village where Rasputin had been born seemed unimaginably far away. But the journey that began there had ended at the heart of one of history's greatest political transformations. After the revolution, Russia entered a period of extraordinary uncertainty. The Romanovs were no longer rulers. Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their children were placed under guard and moved from one location to another. The family that had once lived behind palace walls now lived under strict restrictions. For Alexandra, the loss of Rasputin was still deeply painful. She had believed he was protecting Alexei. Now both her family's political world and her trusted spiritual advisor were gone. Meanwhile, the Bolsheviks were gaining strength. In October 1917, they seized power in Petrograd. The new government promised peace, land, and bread. But taking power was only the beginning. Opposition quickly developed. Russia descended into civil war. The former imperial family became increasingly vulnerable. They were eventually taken to Ekaterinburg, where they were held in the Ipatov house. There, the Romanovs lived under guard, uncertain about their future. The world they had known was disappearing. Nicholas had once commanded armies. Alexandra had once moved through magnificent palaces. Their children had been raised as members of Europe's most powerful royal family. Now they were prisoners, and Rasputin's story became increasingly connected to theirs. People looked back at the final years of the empire and searched for explanations. How could such a powerful dynasty collapse so quickly? Why had the emperor ignored so many warnings? Why had Alexandra trusted Rasputin? Why had aristocrats murdered him? Why had the war continued? There was no single answer. History was more complicated than that. Rasputin had been one piece of a much larger puzzle. His influence mattered, but it was only one part of a political system already under enormous pressure. Then, in July 1918, the Romanov family story came to a violent end. They were executed in Ekaterinburg. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for centuries was gone, and the man who had once stood beside them was already a memory. But Rasputin's legend was only beginning. After Rasputin's death, stories about him began changing almost immediately. People remembered the mysterious peasant who had entered the imperial palace and somehow gained the trust of the empress. But memory is rarely simple. Some stories described him as a holy man who had been misunderstood. Others portrayed him as a dangerous charlatan who had manipulated a vulnerable royal family. And still others turned him into something almost supernatural. The most famous legend concerned his death. According to the dramatic version, Rasputin survived poison, several gunshots, and a brutal attack before finally dying in the frozen river. It is a remarkable story. It is also difficult to verify. Much of the original account came from the conspirators themselves, particularly Felix Yusupov. Later historians discovered inconsistencies in those accounts. The supposed poison has never been firmly established. The exact sequence of the shooting remains uncertain. Even the details of how Rasputin died have been debated. But the legend survived because it fit the character people had already created in their minds. Rasputin seemed impossible to explain, so people began telling a story that made him seem impossible to kill. That is how history can become mythology. A real person lives a complicated life. Years later, people remember only the strangest parts. Then those parts become stories. The stories become legends. And eventually, the legend can become more famous than the person himself. Rasputin is a perfect example. The real man was a Siberian peasant, a husband, a father, a religious wanderer, and a charismatic advisor. He was also flawed. He could be reckless and controversial. He was not the all-powerful magician of later stories. Yet he had something genuinely unusual. He could gain the confidence of people who were difficult to reach. And that ability brought him closer to the most powerful family in Russia. In the end, his mystery was not simply about supernatural powers. It was about human belief. People believed in him. People feared him. People hated him. And people were willing to kill him. That was enough to make Rasputin unforgettable. One of the most interesting questions about Rasputin is whether he truly helped Alexei. The answer is still debated. Alexei's hemophilia made him extremely vulnerable to internal bleeding. Modern medicine understands the condition far better than doctors did in early 20th century Russia. At the time, however, treatment options were limited. When Alexei suffered a serious episode, his parents often felt helpless. Rasputin offered something different. He told the family to remain calm. He encouraged rest and prayer. And sometimes, after Rasputin became involved, Alexei improved. To Alexandra, the connection seemed obvious. But improvement did not necessarily mean a miracle had occurred. Stress and physical activity could make bleeding worse. Keeping Alexei quiet and relaxed may have helped. Some treatments available at the time may also have been harmful. So Rasputin's influence might have helped indirectly, even without supernatural powers. But for Alexandra, the distinction hardly mattered. She had seen her son close to death. Then she had seen him recover. Her faith became stronger, and because she trusted Rasputin, his influence continued. This was one of the most important facts about his entire story. Rasputin did not need to perform a visible miracle. He only needed Alexandra to believe that he could help. Once that belief existed, his position near the Imperial family became extremely difficult to challenge. His enemies understood this. That was why they considered him dangerous. As the years passed, Rasputin's image continued to change. In Russia, memories of him were shaped by revolution, civil war, propaganda, and the destruction of the old imperial order. The Soviet government had little interest in presenting the final years of the Romanovs sympathetically. Rasputin became useful as a symbol of the decadence of the monarchy. His name could represent corruption, superstition, and the supposed weakness of the imperial system. But outside Russia, his story took on a different life. Writers, filmmakers, historians, and journalists became fascinated by the mysterious Siberian. His appearance made him instantly recognizable. His relationship with the royal family provided political drama. His murder offered a sensational ending, and the uncertainty surrounding his life made it easy to turn him into a legend. Over time, the real Rasputin became buried beneath layers of storytelling. The more people repeated the stories, the more convincing they seemed. But historians continued returning to the original evidence. Letters, diaries, government documents, police reports, memoirs, personal accounts. These sources reveal a person who was far more complicated than either a saint or a monster. Rasputin could be compassionate. He could also be selfish. He could be deeply religious. He could also behave irresponsibly. He could comfort people. He could also create scandal. And perhaps most importantly, he knew how to make people listen. That ability helped him rise from a remote Siberian village to the center of imperial power. It also helped make him one of the most hated men in Russia. His enemies wanted a simple explanation for the country's problems. Rasputin gave them one. But history rarely gives us simple villains. The collapse of the Russian Empire was caused by enormous forces: industrialization, class conflict, political repression, economic hardship, military failure, and the devastating pressure of World War. Rasputin became part of that story. He did not create it. And when the empire finally collapsed, his death could not stop what was coming. His life was over, but the questions surrounding it would survive for generations. Perhaps the most enduring mystery surrounding Rasputin is the question of what he truly believed. Was he sincerely religious? Most evidence suggests that he was. From his early years, Rasputin was drawn toward pilgrimage, prayer, and spiritual searching. He spoke often about God, sin, repentance, and salvation. But his faith did not always fit neatly within traditional Russian orthodoxy. He developed his own ideas about spiritual life and human weakness. He believed that people could become closer to God through confronting their sins rather than simply pretending to be pure. This complicated philosophy sometimes attracted followers. It also created suspicion. Critics accused him of using religion to excuse immoral behavior. Some stories connected him with secret religious groups, although historians have debated how accurate those claims really were. What seems clearer is that Rasputin understood the emotional power of religion. He knew that people were frightened. They feared illness, poverty, death, war, and uncertainty. He offered comfort. That made him powerful. But power gained through personal trust can be fragile. When people stop believing in you, the same qualities that once seemed impressive can suddenly appear threatening. This happened to Rasputin. His intense gaze became sinister. His confidence became arrogance. His religious language became manipulation. His friendships became scandal. His influence became conspiracy. By the end, almost everything he did was interpreted in the worst possible way. Yet Rasputin was not the only person surrounded by contradictions. The entire Russian Empire was living through one. It was a country filled with ancient traditions and modern technology. A vast population ruled by an autocratic emperor. A deeply religious society experiencing rapid industrialization. A royal family trying to preserve an old system while the world around them was changing. Rasputin somehow embodied all of these contradictions. He was a peasant who entered a palace. A religious wanderer who became involved in politics. A man who sought spiritual influence but became famous for worldly scandals. And a person who believed he was helping a royal family that was heading toward destruction. His story was never simple, and that is exactly why it continues to fascinate us. By the time Rasputin entered the final years of his life, the world around him had become increasingly dangerous. He could feel the hostility. Politicians attacked him. Newspapers mocked him. Members of the aristocracy wanted him removed. Even people within the imperial court questioned whether Alexandra's trust in him had gone too far. Yet Rasputin continued moving through Petrograd with remarkable confidence. He seemed to believe that his connection with the imperial family would protect him. For a time, it did. But the political atmosphere was changing. The war had created desperation, and desperation made people willing to take extraordinary risks. Rasputin sometimes warned against continuing the conflict. He believed Russia needed peace. His opponents interpreted such advice differently. Some suspected treason. Others believed he simply did not understand military realities. Again, the truth was more complicated. Rasputin was not a military commander. He was a religious advisor whose opinions were increasingly being treated as political statements. Every word carried greater weight because of where he stood. Then came the final months of 1916. The imperial government was losing authority. Nicholas II remained committed to the monarchy. Alexandra remained convinced that the throne could survive. But the people around them were becoming frightened. Some aristocrats began discussing whether Nicholas needed to be forced into reform. Others believed Rasputin was the central problem. A conspiracy slowly took shape. The conspirators convinced themselves that they were acting for Russia. They believed that eliminating Rasputin might restore confidence in the monarchy. But they misunderstood the depth of the crisis. Russia did not need one man removed. It needed solutions to problems that had been building for decades. Still, the conspirators moved forward. Rasputin was invited to the Yusupov Palace. He entered on that December night believing he was meeting friends. Instead, he walked into a carefully prepared assassination. The man who had spent years surrounded by rumors was about to become the subject of the greatest rumor of all. And before sunrise, Rasputin would be dead. Rasputin's final night has been told many times. Each retelling made it more dramatic. According to Felix Yusupov, Rasputin sat in the palace basement while poisoned cakes and wine were placed before him. The conspirators waited for the poison to work. But nothing happened. Yusupov became nervous. Eventually, he claimed that he shot Rasputin. The man fell. The conspirators believed he was dead. Then, according to the story, Rasputin suddenly moved. He struggled up and tried to escape. The conspirators chased him. More shots were fired. Finally, they captured him and took his body to the river. There, they threw him into the freezing water. The story became legendary, but modern historians are cautious. The famous details come largely from the people involved in the murder. Some parts are inconsistent. The claim that poison played a major role is especially doubtful. What is certain is that Rasputin was shot and killed during a conspiracy involving members of the Russian aristocracy. His body was recovered from the Neva. An examination was conducted. The exact medical details have been debated over the years, and later popular accounts added details that may never have happened. But one fact is beyond doubt. Rasputin was dead. The conspirators believed they had removed a dangerous influence. They had no idea how little time remained for the empire they hoped to protect. Only a few months later, Nicholas II would abdicate. The Romanov dynasty would disappear. Russia would enter revolution and civil war. And the aristocrats who had believed themselves powerful enough to save the monarchy would discover that the system itself was collapsing. Rasputin had not been the cause. He had been one of its most visible symptoms. And perhaps that is why his death feels so strangely connected to the end of Imperial Russia. He disappeared just before the old world disappeared with him. After Rasputin's death, the imperial family continued living in a world that was rapidly falling apart. Alexandra mourned him deeply. To her, he had been more than an advisor. She believed he had helped her son survive. His death therefore felt like a personal tragedy, not simply a political event. Nicholas II, meanwhile, remained determined to continue the war. But Russia was exhausted. The army had suffered enormous losses. The cities faced shortages. Workers were angry. Families were hungry. And faith in the government was disappearing. By February 1917, protests erupted across Petrograd. Women demanding bread filled the streets. Workers joined them. Then soldiers began refusing to suppress the demonstrations. The government lost control. Nicholas tried to respond, but the monarchy no longer had the strength to enforce his orders. Within days, he abdicated. The Romanov dynasty was finished. It had ruled Russia for more than 3 centuries. And Rasputin, who had been accused of secretly controlling that dynasty, had been dead for only a short time. His murder had changed almost nothing. The empire's problems were simply too deep. This is one of the most important lessons of Rasputin's story. A mysterious individual can become a symbol of a nation's problems without actually causing them. Rasputin was certainly influential. He had access to the imperial family. He offered political advice, and his reputation damaged the monarchy. But Russia's collapse came from forces far larger than one man. The war, poverty, political repression, economic instability, and growing opposition had been building for years. Rasputin was caught in the middle of that storm. His life ended before he could see the final collapse. But his name became permanently attached to it. And that is why, more than a century later, people still ask who Rasputin really was. A holy man? A manipulator? A healer? A fraud? Perhaps the answer is that he was all too human. After the Romanovs fell, Rasputin's story entered a new chapter. He was no longer a living man who could defend himself. He had become a memory, and memories can be shaped by whoever tells the story. In the years following the revolution, stories about Rasputin became increasingly dramatic. He was described as a dark influence who had corrupted the imperial court. His name appeared in books, newspapers, memoirs, and political discussions. The more time passed, the more difficult it became to separate fact from rumor. One reason was the enormous amount of gossip surrounding his private life. Rasputin had certainly attracted followers and admirers, including wealthy women who visited him for spiritual advice. But later accounts sometimes transformed these relationships into sensational stories. Some claims were based on real behavior. Others were almost certainly exaggerated. His enemies had powerful reasons to portray him as immoral. If Rasputin could be presented as a depraved man, then Alexandra's trust in him could be presented as evidence of the monarchy's corruption. The story was politically useful, but there was another side. People who knew Rasputin personally sometimes described him as surprisingly warm and compassionate. He could listen carefully to suffering people. He could make frightened individuals feel calmer. He seemed to possess an unusual understanding of human emotions. That may have been one of his greatest gifts. Not magic, not supernatural power, but the ability to make another person believe that they were understood. For a woman like Alexandra, living with constant fear over her son's illness, that ability was extraordinarily important. She trusted him because she believed he helped Alexei. And once that trust was established, almost nothing could break it. Rasputin's story, therefore, becomes a story about belief itself. People do not always believe because they possess perfect evidence. Sometimes they believe because they desperately need hope. And in the terrifying world of Imperial Russia, Rasputin became a source of hope for one family. Outside that family, however, he became a source of fear. The same man could be viewed as a savior by one person and a menace by another. That contradiction would follow his name long after his death. The years after Rasputin's death did not make his story clearer. They made it stranger. As Russia changed under Bolshevik rule, the old imperial world became something from the past. Palaces were taken over, royal titles disappeared, and the people who had once surrounded Nicholas and Alexandra scattered, fled, or died. Rasputin remained one of the most recognizable figures from that vanished world. His photographs traveled far beyond Russia. His long beard and intense expression became almost a symbol of mystery. But the real man was much less simple. He had been born poor. He had traveled as a religious pilgrim. He had become close to the imperial family because of Alexei's illness. He had gained influence through personal trust. And eventually, that influence helped make him a target. The irony was that Rasputin never officially ruled Russia. He was not a minister. He commanded no army. He controlled no major institution. His power came from being listened to, and sometimes being listened to can be more dangerous than holding an official title. People around the imperial family believed his advice mattered. His enemies believed it mattered even more. Eventually, his reputation became larger than his actual influence. That is when the legend truly began. The mysterious Siberian wanderer became a symbol of the final years of the Romanovs. His name came to represent secrecy, scandal, religion, and political failure. Yet behind all of that was still a human being. A husband, a father. After Rasputin's death, his family disappeared from the center of Russian history. His wife, Praskovia, and their children had lived far from the glittering world of the imperial court. They had never possessed the political influence that Rasputin gained in Petrograd. Yet his sudden rise had changed their lives forever. After the revolution, the family faced a very different Russia. The old social order had vanished. People connected with the former imperial world were viewed with suspicion, and Rasputin's name carried a complicated reputation. His family had to live with a legacy they had never created. Meanwhile, Rasputin's story continued spreading around the world. Foreign newspapers became fascinated by the strange Russian mystic who had supposedly influenced an emperor. Books repeated stories about his eyes, his powers, his scandals, and his death. Some accounts made him look almost like a supernatural character. Others presented him as nothing more than a clever fraud. The truth remained somewhere between these extremes. Rasputin had no magical ability to control events. But he possessed something very real: charisma. He could enter a room and attract attention. He could speak with confidence to people far more educated and powerful than himself. And he understood how to build personal relationships. That talent brought him astonishingly close to the Romanovs. But it also made his enemies fear him. In the end, Rasputin's greatest mystery may not be how he survived his final night. It may be how a Siberian peasant managed to enter the private world of Russia's last imperial family at all. The answer begins with faith. Alexandra needed hope for her son. Rasputin offered it. From that simple human need grew a relationship that would eventually become one of the most controversial in Russian history. And as the years passed, that relationship became impossible to separate from the collapse of the empire itself. Rasputin's story also tells us something about the power of fear. The Russian imperial family feared losing Alexei. The public feared hunger and war. Politicians feared revolution. Aristocrats feared the collapse of their privileged world. And Rasputin feared neither the palace nor the people who wanted him gone. But fear can distort judgment. Alexandra's fear for her son strengthened her trust in Rasputin. The public's fear of the monarchy strengthened the rumors surrounding him. And the aristocrats' fear of revolution helped convince them that assassination was necessary. Everyone believed they were responding to danger, yet their actions often made the situation worse. The monarchy became more isolated, public confidence declined, and the distance between the rulers and the people grew wider. Rasputin was caught in the middle of all of it. He was neither the mastermind of Russia's collapse nor an innocent bystander. He accepted influence. He offered advice. He enjoyed his unusual position. And sometimes he behaved in ways that made his enemies' accusations easier to believe. But he was also living inside a system already under tremendous pressure. That distinction matters. History becomes misleading when one person is blamed for an entire nation's disaster. Russia's collapse was the result of many forces coming together. Rasputin simply happened to stand in one of the most visible places when the storm arrived. And perhaps that is why his name has survived so strongly. People remember individuals more easily than systems. It is easier to remember a mysterious man with a long beard than millions of hungry families, exhausted soldiers, political conflicts, and economic problems. But behind Rasputin's legend was an entire country struggling to survive. And while his story feels like a strange mystery, its deepest lesson is surprisingly human. People were looking for someone to trust. Some found that person in Rasputin. Others found someone to blame. And neither belief could stop the events that were already moving toward revolution. More than a century has passed since Rasputin walked through the streets of Petrograd. The Russian Empire is gone. The Romanov dynasty is gone. The world that created Rasputin exists only in photographs, letters, buildings, and memories. Yet his name remains strangely familiar. Part of that is because his story contains everything that makes historical mysteries fascinating. A poor man who entered a palace. A royal family desperate to save their child. A mysterious religious advisor. Political scandals. A secret assassination. And an empire collapsing around them. But the real story is quieter. Rasputin was not a supernatural creature. He was a human being living during an extraordinary moment. He had strengths and weaknesses. He could inspire trust, but he could also create suspicion. He could speak sincerely about faith while behaving in ways that seemed deeply contradictory. He was capable of kindness and recklessness. That complexity is important, because history is rarely made by perfect heroes or perfect villains. It is made by ordinary human weaknesses interacting with extraordinary circumstances. Rasputin's life demonstrates this perfectly. If Alexei had not suffered from hemophilia, Rasputin might never have become important to the imperial family. If Alexandra had not trusted him, his political influence might have remained small. If Russia had not entered the First World War, the pressure on the monarchy might have developed differently. And if the empire had been more stable, Rasputin's reputation might never have become so enormous. Thousands of small circumstances came together. One life became connected to the fate of a nation. That is what makes history so unpredictable. And tonight, as we look back at Rasputin, perhaps we should remember him not as the immortal monster of legend, but as the complicated man who somehow found himself standing at the edge of a disappearing world. More than a century has passed since Rasputin walked through the streets of Petrograd. The Russian Empire is gone. The Romanov dynasty is gone. The world that created Rasputin exists only in photographs, letters, buildings, and memories. Yet his name remains strangely familiar. Part of that is because his story contains everything that makes historical mysteries fascinating. A poor man who entered a palace, a royal family desperate to save their child, a mysterious religious advisor, political scandals, a secret assassination, and an empire collapsing around them. But the real story is quieter. Rasputin was not a supernatural creature. He was a human being living during an extraordinary moment. He had strengths and weaknesses. He could inspire trust, but he could also create suspicion. He could speak sincerely about faith while behaving in ways that seemed deeply contradictory. He was capable of kindness and recklessness. That complexity is important, because history is rarely made by perfect heroes or perfect villains. It is made by ordinary human weaknesses interacting with extraordinary circumstances. Rasputin's life demonstrates this perfectly. If Alexei had not suffered from hemophilia, Rasputin might never have become important to the imperial family. If Alexandra had not trusted him, his political influence might have remained small. If Russia had not entered the First World War, the pressure on the monarchy might have developed differently. And if the empire had been more stable, Rasputin's reputation might never have become so enormous. Thousands of small circumstances came together. One life became connected to the fate of a nation. That is what makes history so unpredictable. And tonight, as we look back at Rasputin, perhaps we should remember him not as the immortal monster of legend, but as the complicated man who somehow found himself standing at the edge of a disappearing world. In the end, Rasputin's greatest legacy was not political power. It was mystery. Even today, people continue asking the same questions. Did he truly possess unusual healing abilities? Did he control Alexandra? How much influence did he really have over Nicholas II? What exactly happened during his final hours? And why did so many powerful people become obsessed with removing him? Some questions can be answered. Others may never be. Historical evidence can tell us that Rasputin had genuine access to the imperial family. It can show us that Alexandra trusted him deeply. It can document his political recommendations and his relationships with influential people. It can also confirm that aristocratic conspirators murdered him. But evidence becomes weaker when we enter the world of supernatural claims. There is no reliable proof that Rasputin possessed magical powers. There is no solid evidence that he controlled the Russian Empire. And the dramatic story of his supposedly impossible death contains contradictions. The legend is fascinating, but the human story is fascinating enough. A peasant from Siberia reached the highest circles of Russian society. He became a trusted figure to an empress. He became hated by many of her political enemies. And eventually, he was murdered by members of the very aristocracy he had entered. Then, only months later, the monarchy collapsed. That coincidence helped make his story immortal. Rasputin seemed to disappear at exactly the moment the old Russia disappeared. His death became a kind of final symbol. The old empire was dying. Its enemies were closing in. Its rulers were losing control. and the mysterious man who had stood beside them was already gone. Perhaps that is why his story still feels almost dreamlike. It begins in a quiet Siberian village, passes through glittering palaces, and it ends in the darkness of a frozen winter night. A simple life became an extraordinary legend, and the legend survived long after the empire itself was gone. There is one final part of Rasputin's story that is easy to overlook. He did not set out to become famous. He did not begin life planning to influence an emperor. He was simply a man searching for spiritual meaning. His early journeys across Russia brought him into contact with monasteries, pilgrims, priests, and ordinary believers. Those experiences shaped the personality he would later carry into the imperial court. But once he entered the world of power, everything changed. People began watching him. Every friendship became suspicious. Every conversation could become a rumor. Every visit to the palace could become a political story. Rasputin himself seemed to understand that his position was unusual, but he could not fully control what others believed about him. And that is an important part of his tragedy. A reputation can become larger than the person who created it. By the final years of his life, Rasputin's name had become almost impossible to separate from scandal. Even people who knew little about him had an opinion. Some believed he was a holy man. Some believed he was a dangerous fraud. Some believed he was secretly controlling the country. And some simply feared the influence he appeared to possess. Yet the deeper story was about a family. A father and mother terrified of losing their son. An emperor struggling to rule a country at war. An empress desperately searching for someone she could trust. Rasputin entered that emotional world and became important because he gave Alexandra hope. That hope became influence. That influence became controversy. And the controversy eventually became deadly. Perhaps the most haunting part is that none of them could see the full picture. Alexandra could not see that the monarchy was nearing collapse. Nicholas could not understand how quickly public confidence was disappearing. The conspirators could not understand that killing Rasputin would not save the empire. And Rasputin himself could not know that his name would survive for generations. History often works that way. People live inside moments they cannot fully understand. Only later do we see how one event connected to another. Rasputin's life was one of those moments. And so we return to the question that has followed Rasputin for more than a century. Who was he? The safest answer is also the simplest. He was a deeply complicated man. He was religious but imperfect. He was charismatic but controversial. He was influential but not all-powerful. He was trusted by the imperial family, but hated by many of their enemies. And he became famous not because he ruled Russia, but because he stood so close to those who did. His story also reminds us how dangerous political isolation can become. The Romanovs lived inside a world of palaces, advisors, ceremonies, and private fears. The people outside that world experienced Russia very differently. They faced poverty, long working hours, military service, hunger, and uncertainty. The gap between those realities became enormous. Rasputin stood directly between them. To the imperial family, he was a source of comfort. To many ordinary Russians, he became a symbol of everything mysterious and wrong about the palace. That gap helped create his legend. But perhaps the most important lesson is that no single person can explain the collapse of an empire. Rasputin did not start the First World War. He did not create Russia's economic problems. He did not invent political repression. He did not cause the revolution. Those forces were already moving. He simply became one of the most recognizable faces of the final years. And when we remove the myths, his story becomes strangely human. A man searched for faith. He found influence. Influence brought attention. Attention brought enemies. And enemies eventually brought death. His life rose quickly and ended violently. Yet the questions remained. That may be why, even now, Rasputin continues to appear in books, documentaries, films, and conversations about Russian history. The mystery never completely disappears. Perhaps it never will. Now, as we come toward the end of Rasputin's story, the noise surrounding his name can finally begin to fade. The rumors, the political accusations, the stories of miracles, the stories of impossible survival, the legends that grew larger with every generation. Beneath all of them was a human life. Grigori Rasputin was born in a remote Siberian village and grew up far from the centers of power. He became a religious wanderer. He traveled. He prayed. He searched for meaning. Then, through a remarkable series of circumstances, he entered the world of the Romanovs. There, he became trusted by Alexandra because of his relationship with her son. That trust gave him access. Access gave him influence. And influence made him a target. His enemies eventually decided that killing him was necessary. They succeeded, but they could not kill the problems that had made Rasputin powerful in the first place. Russia still had war. Russia still had hunger. Russia still had political division. And the monarchy still lacked the confidence of much of its population. Only months later, the Romanov dynasty collapsed. That timing gave Rasputin's story its haunting quality. He died just before the world he had inhabited disappeared. The palace remained. The streets remained. The Russian people remained. But the empire was gone. Today, Rasputin is remembered in many different ways. Some see a mystic. Some see a manipulator. Some see a tragic figure. Others simply see one of history's strangest personalities. Perhaps all of these views contain a small piece of the truth. But tonight, we can let the legend become quiet. Because history does not always need a final answer. Sometimes the mystery itself is part of the story. And Rasputin's mystery has survived because it reminds us that behind every empire, every revolution. And now, the story of Grigori Rasputin comes quietly to an end. He began life as a peasant in a remote Siberian village, far from palaces, politics, and power. He became a wandering seeker of faith. Then, through a series of extraordinary circumstances, he entered the private world of Russia's final imperial family. He became trusted by Alexandra because she believed he could help her son. That trust brought him closer to the throne. But it also brought suspicion, scandal, and hatred. Russia was already changing. War was exhausting the country. Poverty and shortages were spreading. Political divisions were growing. And the monarchy was losing its connection with the people. Rasputin did not create those problems, but his presence became a symbol of them. Eventually, a group of aristocrats decided that he had to die. They murdered him in the winter of 1916. Only a few months later, Nicholas II abdicated. The Romanov dynasty disappeared, and soon after, the old Russian Empire disappeared with it. Rasputin never lived to see the full transformation, but his name survived. It survived because his story sits at the strange meeting point of faith and politics, hope and fear, truth and legend. Perhaps he was a sincere believer. Perhaps he was also a flawed and ambitious man. Perhaps his greatest power was simply his ability to make people believe in him. Whatever the answer, the mystery remains. And maybe that is where we should leave him tonight. Not as an immortal monster, not as a perfect saint, but as a complicated human being who found himself standing in the final days of a vanished empire. So let the palaces become quiet. Let the winter streets of old Petrograd grow still. Let the voices, arguments, rumors, and political struggles slowly fade into the distance. The story is over. The empire is gone. The legend remains. And somewhere, perhaps beneath another quiet night sky, someone else is listening too. So breathe slowly, relax your shoulders, close your eyes if you wish, and let the strange story of Rasputin, the Siberian wanderer who reached the heart of Imperial Russia, finally drift away into the darkness. Good night,